This is the Socratic dialogue, Euthyphro, by Plato. And if you are unfamiliar with the format, this is a dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro, both characters, who speak to each other. It's written like a short play. Again, if you're unfamiliar with the format. There are times, most of the characters in which Socrates, later Plato, interact with are somewhat of straw men argumentations. And at several points throughout the work, they either agree or encourage Socrates or Plato to continue. And at some points I may skip these, as they don't add to the argumentation. So really, at moments I will be adding narrative elements. Now, in this dialogue, Socrates is on his way to, I believe, a preliminary hearing for his charge of corruption against the youth. And he encounters on his route Euthyphro, who is somewhat of a spiritualist prophet who divines through intuition the nature of the gods and the will of the good. All heavily discussed issues in what we think of as the Socratic dialogues. So without further ado, Euthyphro. Euthyphro starts. What's new, Socrates? To make you leave the Lyceum, where you usually spend your time, to spend it here today at the court of the King Archon. Surely you do not have some sort of lawsuit before the king, as I do. Socrates responds, Athenians don't call it a lawsuit, Euthyphro, but an indictment. He responds, What? Someone has indicted you? Apparently, for I am not going to accuse you of indicting someone else. Socrates, No, I certainly haven't. Euthyphro, but someone else has indicted you? Socrates, Exactly. Who is he? I hardly know the man myself, Socrates responds. Euthyphro, he's young and unknown, it seems, but I believe his name's Miletus. He belongs to the Pythian Deme. If you recall, a Miletus from that Deme, with straight hair, not much of a beard, and a slightly hooked nose. Euthyphro, No, I don't recall him, Socrates, but tell me, what indictment has he brought against you? Socrates, What indictment? Not a trivial one, it seems to me. I mean, it's no small thing for a young man to have come to know such an important matter. You see, according to him, he knows how the young men are being corrupted, and who's corrupting them. He's probably a wise man who's seen that my own ignorance is corrupting his contemporaries, and is coming to accuse me to their mother, the city, so to speak. In fact, he seems to me to be the only one who's starting up in politics correctly. For it is correct to take care of the young first, to make them the best possible, just as it's reasonable for a good farmer to take care of the young plants first and all the others afterwards. And so, Miletus, too, is presumably first weeding out those of us who corrupt the young shoots, as he claims. Then after that, he'll clearly take care of the older people and bring about the greatest goods, both in number and in quality, for the city. That, at any rate, is the likely outcome of such a start. Euthyphro responds, I hope it happens, Socrates, but I am terribly afraid the opposite may result. You see, by attempting to do an injustice to you, it seems to me he is simply starting out by wrongdoing the city at its very hearth. Tell me, what on earth does he say you're doing that corrupts the youth? Socrates. Strange things, my excellent friend. At any rate, on first hearing, he says I'm an inventor of gods, and because I invent new gods and don't acknowledge the old ones, he's indicted me for the latter's sake. So he says. Euthyphro. I understand, Socrates. That's no doubt because you say your daimonic sign comes to you on each occasion. So he has written this indictment against you for making innovations in religious matters, and comes before the court to slander you, knowing that such things are easy to misrepresent to the majority of people. Why, they even mock me as if I were crazy when I speak in the assembly on religious matters and predict the future for them. And yet, not one of my predictions has failed to come true. But all the same, they envy anyone like ourselves. We mustn't give them a thought, though. Just meet them head on. Socrates. Yes, my dear Euthyphro, but being mocked is presumably nothing to worry about. Athenians, it seems to me, aren't much concerned if they think someone's clever, so long as he doesn't teach his own wisdom. But if they think he's making other people wise like himself, they get angry, whether out of envy, as you say, or for some other reason. Euthyphro. As to that, I certainly have no desire to test their attitude towards me. Socrates. Don't worry. They probably think you rarely put yourself at other people's disposal and aren't willing to teach your own wisdom. But I'm afraid they think my love of people makes me tell whatever little I know unreservedly to any man. Not only without charging a fee, but even glad to lose money so long as someone cares to listen to me. So I was just saying, if they were going to mock me, as you say they do you, there'd be nothing unpleasant about their spending time in the law court playing around and laughing. But if they're going to be serious, the outcome's unclear, except to you prophets. Euthyphro. Well, it will probably come to nothing, Socrates, and you fight your case satisfactorily, as I think I'll fight mine. Socrates. But now, Euthyphro, what is this case of yours? Are you defending or prosecuting? Euthyphro. Prosecuting. Whom? Someone I'm, again, thought to be a crazy for prosecuting. Socrates. What's that? Is your prosecution a wild goose chase? Euthyphro. The goose is long past chasing. He's quite old. Who is he? Euthyphro responds, my father. My good man, your own father? Yes, indeed. But what's the charge? What's the lawsuit about? Murder, Socrates. Socrates responds, in the name of Hercules. Well, Euthyphro, I suppose most people don't know how it can be correct to do this. I mean, I can't imagine an ordinary person taking that action correctly, but only someone who's already far advanced in wisdom. Yes, by Zeus, Socrates, far advanced indeed, Euthyphro responded. Is the man your father killed one of your relatives, then? Of course, he must be, mustn't he? You'd hardly be prosecuting him for murder on behalf of a stranger. Euthyphro responds, it's ridiculous, Socrates, for you to think it makes any difference whether a dead man's a stranger or a relative. It's ridiculous not to see that the sole consideration should be whether the killer killed justly or not. If he did, let him go. If he didn't, prosecute. If, that is to say, The killer shares your own hearth and table. For the pollution's the same if you knowingly associate with such a person and don't cleanse yourself and him by bringing him to justice. In point of fact, though, the victim was a day laborer of mine. And when we were farming on Naxos, he worked the land for us there. Well, he got drunk, became enraged with one of our household slaves, and cut his throat. So my father tied him hand and foot, threw him in a ditch, and sent a man here to find out from the official interpreter what should be done. In the meantime, he ignored and neglected his captive as a murderer, thinking it mattered nothing if he did die. And that's just what happened. Hunger, cold, and being tied up caused his death before the messenger got back from the interpreter. That's precisely why my father and my other relatives are angry with me, because I'm prosecuting my father for murder on the murderer's behalf, when my father didn't even kill him, so they claim. And when, even if he is definitely did kill him, it's wrong, since the dead man was a murderer, to concern yourself with the victim in that case. You see, it's impious, they say, for a son to prosecute his father for murder. Little do they know, Socrates, about the god's position on the pious and the impious. Socrates responds, "But in the name of Zeus, Euthyphro, do you think you have such exact knowledge about the position the gods take, and about the pious and the impious, that in the face of these events you've no fear of acting impiously yourself in bringing your father to trial?" Euthyphro says, "It'd be no use at all, Socrates. And Euthyphro," referring to himself in the third person, "would be no different from the majority of people if I didn't have exact knowledge of all such things." Socrates responds, "So, my excellent Euthyphro, the best thing, it seems, is for me to become your student, and to challenge Meletus on this very point before his case comes to trial, telling him that even in the past I always considered it of great importance to know about religious matters, and that now, when he says I've done wrong through impoverishing and innovating concerning the gods, I've become your student. Shouldn't I say to him, Meletus, if you agree that Euthyphro is wise about the gods, you should also regard me as correctly acknowledging them and drop the charge. But if you don't agree, prosecute this teacher of mine rather than me, for corrupting the old men, myself, and his own father, me by his teaching and his father by admonishment and punishment. If he isn't convinced by me and doesn't drop the charge, or prosecute you instead of me, shouldn't I say the same things in court as in my challenge to him?" Euthyphro agrees, "Yes, by Zeus, Socrates. And if he tried bringing an indictment against me, I think I'd soon find his weak spots, and the question in court would very quickly be about him rather than about me." Socrates says, "I realize that as well as you do, my dear friend, and that's why I'm eager to become your student. I know that Meletus, as well as others, no doubt, pretends not to notice you at all, whereas he has seen me so sharply and so easily that he has indicted me for impiety. Now then, in the name of Zeus, tell me what you were just claiming to know so clearly. What sort of thing would you say the holy and unholy are, whether in case of murder or anything else? Or isn't the pious itself the same as itself in every action? And conversely, isn't the impious entirely the opposite of the pious? And whatever's going to court as impious isn't itself similar to itself? Doesn't it, as regards impiety, possess one single characteristic? Absolutely, Socrates, Euthyphro agrees. Tell me then, what do you say the pious and the impious are? Euthyphro responds, very well. I say that what's pious is precisely what I'm doing now, prosecuting those who commit an injustice, such as murder, or temple robbery, or those who've done some other such wrong, regardless of whether they're one's father, or one's mother, or anyone else whatever. Not prosecuting them, on the other hand, is what's impious. Why, Socrates, look at the powerful evidence I have that the law requires this. Evidence I've already offered to show other people that such actions are right, that one must not let an impious person go, no matter who he may happen to be. You see, those very people acknowledge Zeus as the best and most just of the gods, and yet they agree that he puts his own father in fetters because he unjustly swallowed down his children, and that he, in his turn, castrated his father because of one similar injustice. Yet they're extremely angry with me because I'm prosecuting my father for his injustice, and so they contradict themselves in what they say about the gods and about me. Socrates interjects, could this be reason, Euthyphro? Could this be the reason, Euthyphro, I face indictment, that when people say such things about the gods, I find them somehow hard to accept? That, it seems, is why some people will say I'm a wrongdoer. But now, if you, who know so much about such matters, share these views, it seems that the rest of us must assent to them. I mean, what can we possibly say in reply, when we admit ourselves that we know nothing about them? But tell me, by the God of friendship, do you really believe those stories are true? Yes, Euthyphro responds, and still more amazing thing, Socrates, that the majority of people don't know. Socrates responds, and do you believe that there really is war among the gods, and terrible hostilities and battles and other such things of this sort? The poets relate, and that the good painters embroider on our sacred objects. I'm thinking particularly of the robe covered with embroideries of such scenes that's carried up to the Acropolis at the great Pantheon festival. Are we to say that these are true, Euthyphro? Not only those, Socrates, but as I mentioned just now, I will, if you like, tell you lots of other things about religious matters that I'm sure you'll be amazed to hear. Socrates responds, I wouldn't be surprised, but tell me about some other time, when we've the leisure. Now, however, try to answer more clearly the very question I asked before. You see, my friend, you didn't teach me adequately earlier when I asked what the pious was. But if you told me what you're now doing is pious, prosecuting your father for murder. Yes, and what I said was true, Socrates. Perhaps, but surely, Euthyphro, there are also many other things you call pious. Yes, indeed. Socrates then questions, do you remember then that what I urged you to do wasn't to teach me about one or two of the many pieties, but rather about the form itself, by virtue of which all the pieties are pious? You see, you said, I believe, that it was by virtue of one of the characteristics that the impieties are impious, and the pieties are pious, or don't you remember? I do indeed. Socrates goes on, then teach me what that characteristic itself is, in order that by concentrating on it and using it as a model, I may call pious any action of yours or anyone else's that is such as it is, and may deny to be pious whatever isn't such as it is. If that's what you want, Socrates, that's what I'll tell you. That is what I want. Euthyphro responds, in that case, what's loved by the gods is pious, and what's not loved by the gods is impious. Excellent, Euthyphro. You've now given me the sort of answer I was looking for. Whether it's true, however, that I don't know, but clearly you'll go on to demonstrate fully that what you say is true. Yes, indeed, Socrates continues. Come on, then, let's examine what it is we're saying. A God-loved thing or a God-loved person is pious, whereas a God-hated thing or a God-hated person is impious. And the pious isn't the same as the impious, but its exact opposite. Isn't that what we're saying? It is indeed. And does it seem to be true? It does seem so, Socrates. Socrates says, and haven't we also said that the gods quarrel and differ with each other? And that there's mutual hostility among them? Indeed, we did say that. But what are the issues, my good friend, on which differences produce hostility and anger? Let's examine it this way. If you and I differed about which of two groups was more numerous, would our differences on this issue make us hostile and angry towards one another? Or would we turn to calculation and quickly resolve our differences? Euthyphro says, of course. Socrates pries. Again, if we differed about which was larger or smaller, we'd turn to measurement and quickly put a stop to our differences. That's right, Euthyphro concedes. And we'd turn to weighing, I imagine, to settle dispute about which was heavier or lighter? Certainly. Then what sort of issues would make us angry and hostile toward one another if we disagreed about them and were unable to reach a settlement? Perhaps you can't say just offhand, but examine, while I'm speaking, whether there are issues about the just and unjust, fine and shameful, good and bad, whether we become enemies. Aren't these the issues of which disagreement and inability to reach a settlement make enemies of us? Both you and I, and all other human beings? Euthyphro responds, that is the difference, Socrates, and those are the things it has to do with. Socrates asks, and what about the gods, Euthyphro? If indeed they differ, mustn't it be about those same things? Absolutely. Socrates continues, then according to your account, my noble Euthyphro, different sets of gods, too, consider different things to be just or fine or shameful or good or bad. For if they didn't differ about these, they wouldn't quarrel, would they? Euthyphro says, that's right. Then are the very things that each group of them regards as fine, good, and just also the ones they love, and are the opposite of these the ones they hate? Of course, Euthyphro concedes. But the very same things, so you say, that some gods consider to be just and others unjust, are also the ones that lead them to quarrel and war with one another when they have disputes about them. Isn't that right? It is. And the same things, it seems, are both hated and loved by the gods, and so the same things would be both God-hated and God-loved. It seems that way. So on your account, Euthyphro, the same things would be both pious and impious. Apparently, Euthyphro concedes. So haven't you answered my question, my excellent friend? So you haven't answered my question, my excellent friend. You see, I wasn't asking you what the self-same thing is that's both pious and impious, but a thing that's God-loved is, it seems, also God-hated. It follows, Euthyphro, that it wouldn't be at all surprising if what you're now doing in prosecuting your father was something pleasing to Zeus, but displeasing to Kronos and Uranus, or lovable to Hephaestus and displeasing to Hera. And similarly, for any other gods who may differ from one another on the matter. Euthyphro speaks up and says, but Socrates, I think that on this point, at least, none of the gods do differ, that anyone who has unjustly killed another should be punished. Socrates asks, is that so? Well, what about men, Euthyphro? Have you never heard them arguing that someone who has killed unjustly or done anything else unjustly should not be punished? Why, yes, they never stop arguing like that, whether in the law courts or in other places, for people who've committed all sorts of injustices will do or say anything to escape punishment. Socrates replies, but do they agree, Euthyphro, that they've committed injustice, and, in spite of agreeing, do they still say that they shouldn't be punished? No, certainly they don't say that. Socrates, so it isn't just anything that they'll do or say. You see, I don't think they dare to say or argue that if they act unjustly, they should not be punished. Instead, I think they are denying acting unjustly, don't they? That's true, they do. Socrates continues, so they don't argue that someone who acts unjustly should not be punished, though they do perhaps argue about who acted unjustly, what his unjust actions consisted of, and when he did it. That's true. Then doesn't the very same thing happen to the gods as well, if indeed they do quarrel about just and unjust actions, as on your account they do, and if one lot says that others have done wrong, and another lot denies it, for surely no one, my excellent friend, whether god or human being, dares to say that one who acts unjustly should not be punished. Euthyphro says, yes, what you say is true, Socrates, at least the main point. Socrates continues, I think that men and gods who argue, Euthyphro, if indeed gods really do argue instead about actions. It's about some action that they differ, some of them saying that it was done justly, others unjustly. Isn't that so? Of course, says Euthyphro. Socrates continues, come then, my dear Euthyphro, and teach me too, that I may become wiser. A man committed murder while employed as a day laborer, and dies as a result of being tied up before the master, who tied him up, found out from the proper authorities what to do about him. What evidence do you have that all the gods consider this man to have been killed unjustly, and that it's right for a son to prosecute and denounce his father for murder on behalf of such a man? Come, try to give me a clear proof that all gods undoubtedly consider this action to be right. If you can give me adequate proof of that, I'll never stop praising your wisdom. Euthyphro responds, but presumably that's no small task, Socrates, though I could, of course, prove it to you very clearly. Socrates responds to the challenge, I understand. You think I'm a slower learner than the jury, since it's clear that you'll prove to them that those actions of your fathers were unjust and that all the gods hate them. Euthyphro, I'll prove it to them very clearly, Socrates, provided they'll listen to what I say. Socrates responds, they'll listen all right, provided you seem to speak well. But a thought occurred to me while you were speaking, and I'm still examining it in my own mind. Suppose Euthyphro so taught me that I became thoroughly convinced that all the gods do consider a death like that to be unjust. What more would I have learned from Euthyphro about what the pious and the impious are? That action would indeed be God-hated, so it seems. Yet it became evident just now that the pious and the impious aren't defined by that fact, since it became evident that what's God-hated is also God-loved. So I'll let you off that point, Euthyphro. If you like, let's suppose that all the gods consider the action unjust, and that they all hate it. Is it then the correction we're now making in the account that what all the gods hate is impious, while what they all love is pious, and that whatever some love and others hate is neither or both? Is that how you'd now like us to define the pious and the impious? Euthyphro says, "What's to prevent it, Socrates?" "Nothing on my part, Euthyphro, but you examine your own view, and whether by assuming it, you'll most easily teach me what you promised." Euthyphro responds, "All right. I'd say that the pious is what all the gods love, and its opposite, what all the gods hate, is impious." Socrates, "Then aren't we going to examine that in turn, Euthyphro, to see whether what we've said is true, or are we going to let it alone and accept from ourselves and from others just as it stands? As if someone merely asserts that something is so, are we going to concede that it's so, or are we going to examine what the speaker says?" Euthyphro says, "We're going to examine it. However, I, for my part, think that this time what we've said is true." Socrates, "Soon, my good friend, we'll better be able to tell. Consider the following. Is the pious loved by the gods because it's pious, or is it pious because it's loved?" Euthyphro says, "I don't know what you mean, Socrates." Socrates clarifies, "All right, I'll try to put it more clearly. We speak of a thing's being carried or carrying, and of its being led or leading, and of being seen or seeing. And you understand that these things are all different from one another, and how they differ?" Euthyphro says, "I think I understand at any rate." Socrates, "Then is there also something that's loved, and is it different from something that's loving?" "Certainly." "Then tell me whether the carried thing is a carried thing because it's carried, or because of something else." Euthyphro responds, "No, it's because of that." Socrates, again, "The led thing is so, then, because it's led, and the seen thing because it's seen." "Of course." "So it's not seen because it's a seen thing. On the contrary, it's a seen thing because it's seen. Nor is it because it's a led thing that it's led. Rather, it's because it's a led thing that it's a led thing. Nor is something carried because it's a carried thing. Rather, it's a carried thing because it's carried. So, is what I mean completely clear, Euthyphro? I mean this. If something's changed in some way or affected in some way, it's not changed because it's a changed thing. Rather, it's a changed thing because it is changed. Nor is it affected because it's an affected thing. Rather, it's an affected thing because it's affected. Or don't you agree with that?" Euthyphro responds, "I do." Socrates, "Then isn't a loved thing, too, either a thing changed or a thing affected by something?" "Of course." And so the same holds of it as of our earlier examples. It's not because it's a loved thing that it's loved by those who love it. Rather, it's because it's loved that it is a loved thing. "Necessarily," replies Euthyphro. Socrates, "Now what we are saying about the pious, Euthyphro, on your account, isn't it loved by all the gods?" "Yes." Socrates then says, "So is that because it's pious, or because of something else?" "No, it's because it's pious." Socrates, "So it's loved because it's pious, not pious because it's loved." "Apparently," Euthyphro concedes. Socrates then states, "On the other hand, what's God loved is loved. That is to say, God loved because the gods love it." "Certainly," Euthyphro replies. Socrates, "Then the God loved is not what's pious, Euthyphro, nor is the pious what's God loved, as you claim, but one differs from the other. Euthyphro asks, "How so, Socrates?" Probably quite confused at this point in the conversation. Socrates replies, "Because we agreed that the pious is loved because it's pious, not pious because it's loved, didn't we?" "Yes," Socrates then states, "the God loved, on the other hand, is so because it's loved by the gods. It's God loved by the very fact of being loved. But it's not because it's God loved that it's being loved." "That's true," concedes Euthyphro. Socrates then argues, "But if the God loved and the pious were really the same thing, my dear Euthyphro, then if the pious were loved because it's pious, what's God loved would in turn be loved because it's God loved. And if what's God loved were God loved because it was loved by the gods, and the pious would in turn be pious because it was loved by them. But as it is, you can see that the two are related in the opposite way, as things entirely different from one another. For one of them is lovable because it's loved, whereas the other is loved because it is lovable. And so, Euthyphro, when you're asked what the pious is, it looks as though you don't want to reveal its being to me, but rather to tell me one of its affections, that this happens to be the pious, that it's loved by all the gods. What explains its being loved, however, you still haven't said, so please don't keep it hidden from me, but rather say again from the beginning what it is that explains the pious being loved by the gods or having some other affection, for we won't disagree about which one it has. Summon up your enthusiasm, then, and tell me what the pious and the impious are." Euthyphro, reeling, I'm sure, "But Socrates, I have no way of telling you what I have in mind, for whatever proposals we put forward keep somehow moving around and won't stay put." Socrates says, "Your proposal, Euthyphro, seems to be the work of my ancestor, Daedalus. Indeed, if I were to state them and put them forward myself, you might perhaps make a joke of me, and say that it's because of my kinship with him that my works of art and words run away and won't stay put." As a side note, there's been several that I haven't explained, but this is particularly in-depth. Daedalus was a sculptor who made statues supposedly so lifelike they ran off. So he's making a pun here. We continue. "You might perhaps make a joke of me and say that it's because of my kinship with him that my works of art and words run away and won't stay put. But as it is, the proposals are your own. So you need a different joke, since it's for you that they won't stay put, as you can see yourself." Euthyphro responds, "But it seems to me, Socrates, that pretty much the same joke does apply in the case of our definitions. You see, I'm not the one who makes them move around and not stay put. Rather, you seem to me to be Daedalus, since as far as I'm concerned, they would have stayed put." Socrates responds, "Then, my friend, it looks as though I've grown cleverer in my area of expertise than my venerated ancestor, in that he made only his own works not stay put, whereas I do this to my own, it seems, and also to other people's. And the most subtle thing about my area of expertise is that I'm wise in it without wanting to be. You see, I'd prefer to have accounts stay put and be immovable, established for me, than to acquire the wealth of Tantalus." Wealthy man, it's where we get the word tantalizing from. "And the wisdom of Daedalus combined. But enough of this. Since you seem to me to be getting sated, I'll do my best to help you teach me about the pious. And don't you give up before you do. See whether you don't think that the pious as a whole must be just. Euthyphro says, yes, I do. Then, is the just as a whole also pious? Or, while the pious as a whole is just, is the just as a whole not pious, but part of it pious and part of it something else? Euthyphro admits, I don't follow what you're saying, Socrates. Socrates attempts to clarify, and yet you're much younger and wiser than I, but as I say, your wealth of wisdom has weakened you. Well, pull yourself together, my dear fellow. What I'm saying isn't hard to understand. You see, what I'm saying is just the opposite of what the poet said, who wrote, with Zeus, the maker, who caused all these things to come about, you will not quarrel, since where there's dread, there's shame, too. I disagree with this poet. Shall I tell you where? Euthyphro implores him to do so. It doesn't seem to me that where there's dread, there's shame, too. For many people seem to me to dread disease and poverty and many other things of that sort, but they dread them, and they feel no shame at what they dread. But where there's shame, there is also dread. For if anyone feels shame at a certain action, if he's ashamed of it, doesn't he fear, doesn't he dread a reputation for wickedness at the same time? He certainly does dread it, Euthyphro admits. Socrates go on. Then it isn't right to say that where there's dread, there's shame too. But where there's shame, there's also dread. Even though shame isn't found wherever there's dread. You see, dread is broader than shame, I think. For shame is a part of fear, just as odd is a number. Hence, when there's a number, there isn't something odd too. But where there's something odd, there is also a number. Do you follow me now, at least? Euthyphro says, of course. Well, that's the sort of thing I was asking just now. Whether there's something just, whenever there is something just, is there also something pious? Or is something just whenever it's pious, but not pious whenever it's just? Because the pious is part of the just. Is that what we're to say, or do you disagree? And Euthyphro offers the throwaway, no, let's say that, since it seems to me you're right. Then consider the next point. If the pious is part of what's just, we must, it seems, find out what part of the just is what part of the just the pious is. Now, you asked me about one of the things we just mentioned. For example, which part of number is the even? That is to say, what sort of number it is. I'd say it's any number not indivisible by 2, but divisible by it. Or don't you agree? Yes, I do, says Euthyphro. Socrates says, then you try to teach me in the same fashion what part of the just is pious. Then we can tell Miletus not to treat us unjustly any longer or indict us for impiety, since I've now been sufficiently instructed by you about what things are holy or pious and what aren't. Well then, it seems to me, Socrates, that the part of the just that's holy or pious is the one concerned with tending to the gods, while the remaining part of the just is concerned with tending to human beings. Socrates says, you seem to me to have put it very well, Euthyphro, but I'm still lacking one small piece of information. You see, I don't yet understand this tending you're talking about. You surely don't mean that in just the way that there's tending to other things. There's tending to the gods too. We don't speak this way, do we? We say, for example, that not everyone knows how to tend to horses, but only horse trainers. Isn't that right? He agrees. Because horse training is expertise in tending to horses. Yes. Nor does everyone know how to tend to dogs, but only dog trainers. Euthyphro agrees, and Socrates says, because dog training is expertise in tending to dogs. And cattle breeding is expertise in tending to cattle. Well, but piety or holiness is tending to the gods, Euthyphro. That's what you're saying? Euthyphro says it is. Socrates says, but doesn't all tending accomplish the same end? I mean, something like some good or benefit for what's being tended to. As you see, that horses tended to by horse trainers are benefited and made better. Or don't you agree that they are? And so dogs, of course, are benefited by dog training and cattle by cattle breeding, and similarly all of these. Or do you think that tending aims to harm what's being tended? And Euthyphro admits, no, by Zeus, I don't. And Socrates says, rather it aims to benefit it? And Euthyphro says, certainly. Socrates argues, then if piety is tending to the gods, does it benefit the gods and make the gods better? Would you concede that whenever you do something pious, you're making some god better? No, by Zeus, I wouldn't, Euthyphro responds. Socrates continues, no, I didn't think that was what you meant, Euthyphro, far from it. But it is why I asked what you did mean by tending to the gods, because I didn't think you meant that sort of tending. And you were right, Socrates, since it's not the sort I meant. Socrates says, all right, but then what sort of tending to the gods would the pious be? Euthyphro says, the very sort of tending, Socrates, that slaves provide to their masters. Socrates says, I understand, and then it would seem to be some sort of service to the gods. Euthyphro says, it is indeed. Socrates argues, now, could you tell me more about service to doctors? What result does that service, insofar as it is service, aim to produce? Don't you think it aims at health? Euthyphro says, I do. Socrates asks, what about service to shipbuilders? What result does service aim to produce? Euthyphro says, clearly, Socrates, its aim is a ship. Socrates says, and in the case of service to builders, I suppose, the aim is a house. Euthyphro says, yes. Socrates asks, then tell me, my good friend, at what result does service to the gods aim? Clearly, you know, since you say you've a finer knowledge of religious matters than any other human being. Euthyphro boasts, yes, and what I say is true, Socrates. Socrates responds, then tell me, in the name of Zeus, what is that supremely fine result that the gods produce by using our services? Euthyphro answers, they produce many fine ones, Socrates. Socrates continues, so too do generals, my friend. Nonetheless, you could easily tell me the main one, which is to produce victory in war, is it not? Certainly, Euthyphro agrees. And farmers too, I think, produce many fine results. Nonetheless, the main one is to produce food from the earth. Of course. What, then, about the many fine results that the gods produce? Which is the main one they produce? Euthyphro responds, I told you a moment ago, Socrates, that it is a pretty difficult task to learn the exact truth about all of these matters. But to put it simply, if a person knows how to do and say things that are pleasing to the gods in prayer and sacrifice, those are the ones that are pious. And actions like them preserve both the private welfare of households and the common welfare of the city, whereas those that are the opposite of pleasing are unholy, and they, of course, overturn and destroy everything. Socrates responds, if you'd wanted to, Euthyphro, you could have put the main point I asked about much more briefly. But if you're not eager to teach me, that's clear. You see, when you were just now on the point of answering, you turned away. If you had given the answer, I'd already have been adequately instructed by you about piety. But as it is, the question must follow of the one being questioned wherever he leads. Once again, then, what are you saying that the pious or piety is? Didn't you say that it was some sort of knowledge of sacrificing and praying? Euthyphro says, yes, I did. Socrates asks, and sacrificing is giving to the gods, and praying is asking from them. Euthyphro says, yes, indeed, Socrates. Socrates continues, so on that account, piety would be knowing how to ask from the gods and how to give to them. You've grasped my meaning perfectly, Socrates, Euthyphro responded. Socrates says, yes, my friend, and that's because I really desire your wisdom, and apply my mind to it so that what you say won't fall on barren ground. But tell me, what is this service to the gods? You say it's asking for things from them and giving things to them. Euthyphro says, I do. Socrates, well then, wouldn't asking in the right way consist of asking for things we need from them? Euthyphro says, what else could it be? Socrates presses, and conversely, giving in the right way would consist of giving them, in turn, the things they need from us, for surely giving someone what he didn't need at all isn't something that an expert in the art of giving would do. Then piety, Euthyphro, would be a sort of expertise in mutual trading between gods and men. And Euthyphro says, yes, trading, if that's what you prefer to call it. Socrates says, I don't prefer anything, if it isn't true. But tell me, what benefit do the gods get from the gifts they receive from us? I mean, what they give is clear to everyone, since we possess nothing good that they don't give us. But how are they benefited by what they receive from us? Or do we get so much the better of them in the trade that we receive all our good things from them while they receive nothing from us? Euthyphro argues, but Socrates, do you really think gods are benefited by what they receive from us? Socrates says, if not, Euthyphro, what could those gifts of ours to gods possibly be? Euthyphro says, what else do you think but honor and reverence? And, as I said just now, what's pleasing to them? Socrates questions, so is the pious pleasing to the gods, Euthyphro, but not beneficial to them or loved by them? Euthyphro says, no, I think that it's, in fact, the most loved of all. Socrates says, so once again, it seems the pious is what's loved by the gods. Absolutely, Euthyphro agrees. Socrates continues, well, if you say that, can you wonder that your accounts seem not to stay put, but to move around? And will you accuse me of being the Daedalus who makes them move, when you yourself are far more expert than Daedalus in the art of making them move in a circle? Or don't you see that your account has circled back again to the same place? For surely you remember that earlier we discovered the pious and the God-loved are not the same, but different from one another. Or don't you remember that? And Euthyphro says, yes, I do. And Socrates admonishes, then don't you realize that you're now saying the pious is what the gods love, and that's the same, isn't it, as what's God loved? Or is that not so? Of course it is, he agrees. Then Socrates says, then either we weren't right to agree before, or if we were right, our present suggestion is wrong. So it seems, Euthyphro announces. Socrates, So we must examine again from the beginning what the pious is, since I won't willingly give up until I learn this. Don't scorn me, but apply your mind to the matter in as many ways as fully as you can, and then tell me the truth, for you must know it, if indeed any human being does. And like Proteus, you mustn't be let go until you tell it, for if you didn't know with full clarity what the pious and impious are, you'd never have ventured to prosecute your own father for murder on behalf of a day laborer. On the contrary, you wouldn't have risked acting wrongly because you have been afraid before the gods and ashamed before men. As things stand, however, I well know that you think you have fully clear knowledge of what's pious and what isn't. So tell me what you think it is, my excellent Euthyphro, and don't conceal it. Euthyphro's final line. Some other time, Socrates. You see, I'm in a hurry to get somewhere, and it's time for me to be off. Socrates closes by saying, What a way to treat me, my friend, going off like that and dashing the high hopes I had that I'd learn from you what things are pious, what aren't, and what aren't. Then I'd escape Meletus's indictment by showing him that Euthyphro had now made me wise in religious matters, and ignorance would no longer cause me to improvise and innovate about them. What's more, I'd live a better way for the rest of my life. And that concludes Euthyphro. Thank you very much for listening. The next should be a conversation about what we just read. Thank you very much for listening, and God bless each and every one of you.